Welcome to the Red Dice Diaries, and this is a first looks video at Children of the Fall by Frenzykitty Games, authored by Gareth H. Graham. Now, Gareth was kind enough to send me a preview so that I could do this first looks video. The preview is a 150-page black and white PDF. You may remember that Graham wrote the excellent Karma storytelling game that I did a first looks video for, and I'll put a link to the video for that down below. Because this is a first looks video and not a review, although this one does run on a little long, I'm not going to give the product a rating, but I'm just recording some of my initial impressions about it. So, the PDF begins with a striking couple of black pages which seem to lay out the wistful memories of someone who has grown up in a world like ours, but has been through a very traumatic event and has had their world turned upside down. Although I know white text on black background can be tricky for some printers, this is certainly very striking, and it instantly sets up that you're about to play a game dealing with young protagonists trying to survive some sort of apocalypse. So, wasting no time at all, we move on to the overview, which tells us that this game is for 3 to 5 players, and that we're going to be playing the young survivors of an apocalypse that has turned all the adults of the world into bloodthirsty savages known as the Fallen. Reading this, I couldn't help but think of the old TV series The Tribe, where a plague wipes out all the adults. It's a compelling idea, young protagonists struggling to survive and grow without a support structure and role models, finding their way in a hostile world. The game provides a block of text to read to the players. Now, generally I'm not a fan of boxed text, but I think since this is a one-off intro and leading into the game, then I'm fine with it. After all, you could always paraphrase it. The game is apparently a GM-less game, and whilst I'm always a little bit sceptical about GM-less games. I don't want to be out of a job, after all. I've played enough of them, including Fiasco and Graham's own Karma, to know that story games can be a fun pastime to engage in, getting everyone involved as combination players and storytellers. GM-less games are also great fillers if you find yourself unable to run a regular campaign game on short notice. You can just pull them out and have an enjoyable few hours and get back to your regular session when you've got all your players or whatever present. The PDF describes Children of the Fall as a discovery-based collaborative game, which makes sense since if you're all creating a narrative together, you have to work with each other to create the story. But by having a group of people, you will often find surprises or elements that you did not consider cropping up. Chapter 2 describes the background of the game. The Fall. Basically, some manner of plague has transformed all the adults into hyper-violent monsters. Even those who were young enough to survive begin to change at some point between 16 to 18 years old. It varies from person to person. I think this is a cool horror element because I think it sets up a dark fate for all our protagonists. They're all going to fall in the end, it's just a matter of time. I can see some people saying, well, if that's going to happen, what's the point? But I think it actually makes the actions the young protagonists take more poignant and the time that they do have more precious. One of the most horrific elements for the setting for me is that the Fallen still mate and then essentially abandon their infants. Beyond this brief background, the details are left for your group to fill in. Chapter 3 of the game discusses Session 0. Now, love them or hate them, they are important in story games because they allow you to create an introduction to the game and establish some group parameters about the world setting. Children of the Fallen splits the session into 4 different phases, followed by character introductions. We have the time since the fall, deciding how long it's been since the world went to shit. Character creation, creating the people you're going to portray the game using playbooks, a concept that will be familiar to anyone who has played a Powered by the Apocalypse game. Building a haven, which is all about creating the place where the characters dwell, drawing a rough map and sketching out the surroundings. Defining the tribe, which is all about the group's goals, their resources, etc. And each of these phases has its own chapter drilling down into it in more detail later in the book. Once this is done, players describe a single scene or vignette detailing who their characters used to be and how they responded when the world initially fell. So next we move on to, after some guidelines, we move on to how to play the game. So, Play begins by the player selecting a mission. The missions are printed in the back of the book, and they involve various tasks, gathering resources, etc., that the tribe might undertake to survive and prosper. Play is split into 4 acts, and each player takes the opportunity to frame a scene in each act. This reminds me a lot of Karma and Fiasco. It's a mechanic that I've seen used to great effect in those games. Act 1 sets up the story. The majority of the action occurs in Act 2 and 3, and Act 4 brings it to some sort of conclusion. An act are tracked on the mission sheet using a marker. On your turn, the active player describes who and what is involved in the scene. Not all of the player characters have to be present, but the active character has to be there. The scene is then role-played out in a more traditional fashion. However, the active player has total agency over all aspects of the game during their scene, with the exception of other players' characters. Given this style, I don't think it's true to say that Children of the Fallen is completely GM-less. Each player effectively GMs in their active phase. The author makes some suggestions, advising players to only focus on exciting and dramatic scenes, often starting them in media res or in the middle of the action, since you only have 4 scenes each in the game. Each player begins the game with 2 story points. You can use these to add complications to another player's scenes. When this is done, you give that player your story point. Children of the Fallen uses D6 for dice rolling, but they're only used when resolving a complication, since normally the active player has complete agency. In general, 2d6 are rolled, and the higher the total you get, the better the outcome. Complications are the primary mechanic and source of uncertainty in Children of the Fallen, adding plot twists and unusual elements. When a complication is triggered, the triggering player describes this complication, and these should always impact negatively on the active player in an interesting way. The active player then rolls 2d6. If they get an 8+, they've avoided the complication, otherwise it occurs. The active player marks a trauma point on their character sheet and role-plays out the complication. When a character has 3 trauma points, one of their downfalls is triggered, and these are various consequences that are described on the playbook. Each player has 1 determination point that they can use to spend when a complication is triggered to roll 3d6 to avoid it rather than 2d6. Players also have a single helix point that they can spend to change the outcome of a single dice roll. We then move on to a section dealing with characters. This section briefly describes the playbooks, all of which seem to have generic concepts suited for a post-apocalyptic setting, such as the leader and the hunter. Of particular interest to me was the prophet, a religious authority who claims to speak for the divine. This playbook comes with a tone warning describing how the inclusion of the playbook can make the game pretty dark and disturbing. Now, I can understand why the authors had to put this warning in, but to be honest, from my point of view, if you pick up a game about children surviving a murderous apocalypse and complain when it gets dark and disturbing, then I have no sympathy for you whatsoever. Players choose a playbook, define their character appearance, and an item called a remnant, which is something they have held onto since before the fall. And there are a number of questions on each playbook to help further define the characters. There are also relationship prompts which define how the character relates to the various other characters in the game. These are sort of fill-in-the-blank style sentences, and they'll be familiar to players of Dungeon World and similar games. Each character also has a secret defined by the player that only they know. Although I'm not sure whether this has a mechanical effect on play at this point, or it's just there to add some colour to the story. The next chapter deals with the Haven, and this details defining the place where the players live and essentially provides some guidelines for sketching out the Haven and drawing a rough outline map for it. Once the map has been drawn, each player gets a chance to define an element of the Haven, and this is a great way of reinforcing the collaborative nature of the game. I like the inclusion of the map as an active element of the game, being altered as the game progresses and the story develops. It also represents a tangible record of how the game is progressing. We then move on to a section that deals specifically with the tribe. And this is chapter 7 of the book. And essentially, a tribe has its own playbook that the players fill in, detailing the name and size of the tribe, along with any items resources that they have as a surplus or that they have a shortage of. I can see this last aspect being very important in a game about survival. The hierarchy of the tribe and any threats that they face are also sketched out at this stage. Essentially, this simple worksheet allows each player to have an input on the shape of the game and also serves as a handy reminder as to the current state of the character's world when combined with the Haven map. The next section of the book deals with missions, and these are essentially the heart of the game, the adventure elements of the game. Missions are defined by the type of mission, along with a series of questions that determine the nature of the mission. For example, if the heroes go on a supply run, the questions are: what supplies are required? Why do you need them ASAP? Where do you plan on obtaining them? And why are there doubts about this mission? And that pretty much rounds off the main part of the book. There is a little bit of advice on creating your own missions once you're used to the game. And we then move on to an appendix, which contains all of the things such as the tribe sheet, the character playbooks, all of the various bits and pieces you need to actually run the game and record what's going on. So, in conclusion, I think Children of the Fall is an extremely interesting game, and it builds on some of the concepts explored in Frenzykitty Games' previous work, Karma. The PDF has a nice, clear layout, as you'll have seen, that I've come to expect from Frenzykitty products, with bold use of a couple of fonts and some striking artwork throughout. As with all collaborative story games, Children of the Fall will only work if you have a group of people willing to buy into the concept that it is selling. You need people who understand that the game is a group attempt to create an interesting story about compelling protagonists and who are comfortable with the shifting of the narrative spotlight and directorial agency. Children of the Fall is not a traditional role-playing game by any means, and I can see some of the meta elements of the game not working for some people. But if you've got a group of players willing to invest the time in it, then I think it will be extremely fun for a one-shot or a short campaign, and I highly recommend you check it out. So there we are, that's my first looks at Frenzykitty Games Children of the Fall. I hope you've enjoyed this review. You consider clicking on like and subscribing to my channel. Until we see you next time, take care and happy gaming.